minute. Okay.
Okay, welcome to the continued study and discussion of the book of 1 Corinthians. Last week we came to the end of the study and discussion of chapter 1. That, of course, as we were primarily looking at the idea of whether or not members of the church were intimidated by the wisdom and knowledge of the world. As we came down to the end of that particular chapter, of course, and looked at the last verses, that according as it is written, that he that glorieth, let him glory in the Lord. And that should be the mindset that those who are New Testament Christians should have toward all things in the world. If we turn our attention to the second chapter of that book, and I, brethren, when I came to you, came not with excellency of speech or of wisdom, declaring unto you the testimony of God. For I determined not to know anything among you save Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling, and my speech and my preaching was not with enticing words of man's wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith should not stand in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. Howbeit we speak wisdom among them that are perfect, yet not the wisdom of this world, nor the princes of this world that come to naught. But we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery, even the hidden wisdom which God ordained before the world unto our glory, which none of the princes of this world knew, for had they known it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So this is a very important section in the epistle. Of course, so much in the epistle is seminal in its effects throughout the centuries that have followed. Here, of course, Paul contending that he did not... Is everybody okay? Okay. Paul here, as he opens this, he contends that he does not use preaching as a vehicle to exhibit his virtuosity. And I think this is something to be reminded of. When I came to you, I came not with excellency of speech, or superiority is one of the ways that that word has been translated as well. He doesn't come to his audience with this idea in mind. Sometimes people come to an audience with the idea in mind to impress them, to overwhelm them. Many other things are about the speaker. The speaker makes it about himself. Paul doesn't look to this to win the admiration from any distinguished persons or to communicate that he is superior to them in any way. He does not reject rhetoric or wisdom as such, but those things that are pompous, those things that are self-serving, the speech of those who are, chapter 4, verse 19, puffed up. This is a sort of a form of verbal gymnastics. Paul says he decided not to know anything. And of course, the literal translation of the Greek for that, I did not decide to know anything, meaning I decided to know nothing. And in contrast to those in Corinth, as we have seen up to this point, and we'll see a little bit later, those in Corinth who always wanted to discern and to rank people by their knowledge and how much they knew. And even later in the book, we see that Paul has to rebuke them because of their arguing over whose spiritual gifts were superior. Paul here narrows this down in a particular way. He wants to limit the knowledge that he claims to know to the knowledge about Christ, the crucified. In other words, that is all he wants to talk about and to share with them. And I think this is an important thing when we go about our teaching others and in our class discussions with others, to make sure that the focus is on the gospel, that the focus is not on how much knowledge we have or the tremendous amount of world experience that we may be able to bring to the conversation. But perhaps is this the problem that we might be seeing in the church today in some way, that we are moving away from our singularity of focus on the gospel? And when I say the gospel, I don't mean to limit it to to the gospel accounts, but the whole counsel of God that Paul preached. Do we contend now that we need to bring in all of these other things in order to elevate the experience of people in understanding the gospel? Brian, is Brian there today? Do we need? Yes, I can hear you. Do we need more than the gospel? Are people desiring more than the gospel?
They may be desiring more than the gospel, but that would surely be out of ignorance, simply because they don't appreciate and understand the beauty, the wonder, the awe, the magnificence, the massive truths that are contained within it. So yes, maybe those outside might think that they want more, but in truth, if a person does start to study the gospel and the word takes a hold on them, and they see the truths and understand the truths, well, it's wonderful for them to have their eyes opened, and I'm sure people realize when that's happening to them.
But it's our responsibility to make sure that they understand the importance of the focus on the gospel. Many people in the religious world today, and many people can be found in some of the liberal-minded churches, are trying to bring in other aspects, other things into play. In the United States, there's a preacher in the North Carolina area who has people in the background while he is speaking. They're drawing and painting pictures. There are people off stage playing musical numbers. All of these things to sort of engage the sensory perceptions of some of the people in a way, and I'm guessing this whole idea is to generate a different type of excitement. Is it that people are not capable of being engaged by the word itself anymore? Michael, is that what we see? Paul in Corinth understood that those brethren, they were fascinated with philosophy, they were fascinated with poetry, they were fascinated with art, but he says, I'm not going to give you any of those things. The only thing that I'm going to preach, the only thing that I'm going to focus on, the only thing that I'm going to set my mind on and to deliver to you is the gospel.
A good discussion sometime might be, when does using prompts and helps go away from the gospel? Does someone drawing a painting in the background as he's teaching something, is that appealing to the gospel or to the person drawing the picture? Does using a blackboard or an overhead projector or puppets or 1,001 other things, and really discuss the aspect of those things as to whether they are a help in teaching the gospel, or whether they actually become the center point of what is being done.
Are we saying then that the gospel, or not we of course, but are they saying that the gospel in and of itself is not sufficient, is not a sufficient means of communication today? Paul says, I determined not to know anything among you. Now, he obviously could have spoken of many other things. He was widely educated. Obviously, he was familiar with poetry, just many other things that we see, sports, and a number of other things that he could bring in to his discussion. But the focus for Paul was always on the Word of God, always on his truth. Are we saying now people think that that's not sufficient, that we need to do something?
I think we do basically see a lot of people who don't believe that the gospel alone is sufficient. That's why you have congregations go out and build gymnasiums and provide entertainment and recreation, things like that. But when you get down to it, you have to draw them that way. You have to draw people by some other means other than the gospel. Just sitting down and teaching the gospel is not sufficient. But the question I was talking about is, when does the use of aids become a going away from the aid to the going away to the aid being the center point?
Well, go ahead. You're going to elaborate on that?
You know, we've had people use in the past chart sermons very effectively. Some people, I remember Brother Joe Malone and Gus Oaf and others were excellent artists who would use would draw a painting as they were preaching, dealing with the subject that they were talking about. So when do those things become, instead of an aid to preaching, the pure gospel and only the gospel, to where they become the center point? Instead of the gospel being the center point, that which they're doing is in reality the center point. Now, when you get off into the, you know, providing entertainment and recreation and trying to, you know, bring in other things, that's obviously contrary to what Paul is teaching here. Our emphasis should be the gospel and the gospel only.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's true, and someone could use Brother Oaf as an example. Certainly, he was one who, in my very early years, used lots of different things to get that message across. However, I don't think anyone who was in the audience for a moment felt that he was giving emphasis to anything other than the gospel.
Well, and that's the whole point. When does it change over? What's the difference between one who appeals to that and one who uses it? Mm-hmm. Is really what you're dealing with there.
Sonny, you had a point you wanted?
Yes, Johnny. Brother Gus Oaf, he came to Singapore to preach in the gospel meetings, and I was there. I was one of those guys who helped him roll and unroll those big charts and hang them on the walls. And I remember that the charts are very, very useful and very, very instructive, and you know, educational as well. And I sat in the audience listening to his gospel sermons, and for 2 years in a row. In fact, he came twice and on the yearly gospel meeting. And when we traveled with him to Malaysia as well, you know, helping him out there, and it was very instructive. I mean, to me, I mean, I remember as a young Christian then, I didn't find the paintings in a sense, distracting to the message itself. I think that it was very helpful and educational, and it helps people focus on the passages written on the charts, so that they could look at it and refer to in the Bible rather than just listening and not taking it in. So yeah, I mean, I had no problems with that. Yeah, it was very good.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, as Michael said, there is a line where the focus by the presenter is in fact the gospel, or it's part of a larger multimedia circus effect where you have a lot of things going on, and along with the message itself being off point, you see that it does become a distraction.
A few years ago, there was a guy who went around Gymnastics for Christ, and another one, Magic for the Master, where they use those things to teach lessons, but the emphasis was became on the magic or on the gymnastics aspect instead of the gospel. And that's where the distinction is. When the emphasis becomes those things instead of God's word, then it becomes wrong.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Paul sort of, when he broaches this subject, we see in the very introduction. Now, all of this really goes back to what had been said previously in the first chapter with regard to 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 17 and following. All of this refers to the preaching of the cross. And here, as he says, he came not with excellency of speech or superiority of speech. Is this something that has become a focus the presenter himself, the eloquence of the speaker, how well he is dressed and tailored. Are all of these factors that we take into consideration today? Are they distractions? Paul?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I think in some cases they can become distractions, especially if you've got somebody who's using these visual illustrations and someone to draw people in, and they know that that's what the people are attracted to. Once you remove those gimmicks, then that's where you start to lose your followers, your brethren. And I do think in many cases a lot of people do not rely on the word and believe that it is enough. But if you are interested in your salvation, then the word ought to be enough.
But do you think people sometimes get carried away with the person who is speaking, let's say the preacher himself, and maybe he comes out and he is very dapper and he's very well tailored and he has a method of fluency in his delivery, which is all well and good, but you think that sometimes that also, not necessarily the intent of the speaker, but that could be something that allows people to become engaged with a cult of personality. I think where you say, oh, he's such a fine speaker, and have you heard this person? Where it should be, have you heard that? What a wonderful message! What a wonderful gospel sermon that was, rather than the emphasis on the person. I think sometimes we do find ourselves very focused on the person rather than the message.
We center so many times upon the presentation instead of the content. Ask people that two different scenarios. One, a speaker who is very monotone and never changes his voice or its inflection and just continues to, but the content is great content as far as the message is concerned. Rotten delivery, great content. On the other hand, you have someone who is exciting and dynamic. He is a great speaker, and but the content is lacking. Which one do you want to hear?
Well, that's the question. That question for us today is easily answered. We want to hear the one with the content, with the message.
But I think most Christians, while they might say that, in reality, it changes as far as the practice.
And that could easily be a way of people being brought into false teaching. Not to say that everyone who has a wonderful delivery style is a false teacher, but sometimes people never get past that to the message itself. I was in Martinez, California. There was a preacher there. A friend of mine said, we need to go hear him. So I said, well, okay, I'll go with you. And of course, he was very eloquent. He was very smooth. This was my early years as a New Testament Christian. I thought, oh, he's suave and dapper and debonair. But his message was completely false. And he had a few little stage antics as well around Galatians 3:26, 27, asking people to come and put on a jacket and could they put it on and all of that sort of stuff. But I think it is something that allows people to just let their mind at ease and go with the presentation. I think that's a problem that we need to always inform the congregation about. It is an example that we go back all the way to the garden, where we see that Satan was very clever, and he obviously didn't approach Eve looking and speaking like the devil he was.
Mm-hmm. The question many times, oh, wasn't he a great speaker? Was What did he say? And a lot of times people can't tell you what the content was.
Well, that could be broad. That might be because they didn't bring anything to the audience in the first place. But that's true. A lot of times a person may have a flowery presentation and have nothing to say. Paul is addressing this in a certain way. He's letting the Corinthians know, when I came to you, I didn't come, like some of these other people came. I didn't come with flowery speech. I didn't come talking about the poetry of these different people, the Cretans. I'm here to speak about the gospel of Christ. That's my emphasis. That's my focus, and that's where your attention should be as well.
Mm.
So I think that as we look at these verses and as we continue through the rest of these in the ongoing weeks, again, we'll pick up from where we are leaving today. Probably going to start with our faith should not stand in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. So if you have an opportunity, join us next week, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, beginning with verse 5. Thank you for watching.